It was supposed to be a quiet weekend of prayer and peace, nothing more. 3 nuns, all from the same convent, embarked on a spiritual retreat deep within the serene hills of northern Vermont. They carried only the essentials: rosaries, Bibles, a few journals. The plan was simple: 2 days of reflection in the wilderness, then a return to their duties. But when Sunday morning arrived and no one heard from them, worry turned to panic. Authorities were called. Search parties were sent. But nothing, not even a footprint, was found. It was as if the earth had opened and swallowed them whole. The disappearance made headlines for a few days, then quietly faded from public memory. The convent fell silent. The forest, untouched and protected, became a place of quiet warning, a stretch of land people passed quickly, speaking little about what was lost there. Families mourned without closure. Questions circled in silence. No evidence, no witnesses, no answers. Just a single tent abandoned near a frozen creek, and the eerie, unshakable stillness of the woods around it. But 35 years later, everything changed. A lone hiker, exploring a rarely used trail during early autumn, slipped near a collapsed ridge and found something buried in the roots of a fallen birch. A leather-bound book, weathered, soft with age, but intact. Inside, handwritten pages, some smudged by water, others preserved so clearly it looked as though the ink had barely dried. A name written on the first page, Sister Marian Devereux. And beneath it, a date, October 9th, 1987. What began as curiosity turned quickly into disbelief. The journal didn't just chronicle prayers or spiritual thoughts. It told a story, fragmented, cryptic, increasingly desperate. Pages filled with unsettling drawings, accounts of distant chanting at night, and entries describing someone, or something, watching them from the woods. A shadow that never moved, but never left. The final pages became almost illegible, the handwriting frenzied. One entry stood alone. He sings beneath the ground. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. But what few people know is that the journal is just the beginning. Because hidden within those pages is a truth more disturbing than anyone ever imagined. A truth that challenges everything we thought we understood about what happened to those 3 women. And once you hear it, once you see it, you'll understand they were never lost. They were taken. The discovery of the journal made national news within days. But the local response was different, quieter, heavier. The townspeople near the old trailhead remember the case all too well. It wasn't just the mystery of the 3 missing nuns that haunted them. It was the silence that followed, the abrupt end to the search, the decision by the diocese to never reopen the investigation. And now, after 3.5 decades, those ghosts had returned, not in the form of bodies, but in ink and paper. Authorities moved swiftly to secure the area. A team of forensic experts, along with religious archivists from the diocese, descended on the forest with metal detectors, drones, and cadaver dogs. The old camp location was found after 3 days of sweeping. A small clearing beneath a broken canopy, marked by moss-covered stones arranged in a precise triangle. Beneath the soil, they uncovered the remains of a tent, several rusted utensils, and a crucifix partially buried in the roots of a tree. Time had erased much, but not everything. The journal itself was kept under lock and key, but a partial transcription leaked. And that was when things shifted. Because what Sister Marianne described went far beyond the narrative of 3 women simply getting lost. She wrote of strange symbols carved into the bark of trees, of sounds echoing through the valley at night, like chanting, always just beyond reach. She spoke of Sister Agnes sleepwalking, standing for hours at the edge of the clearing, staring at the same tree, murmuring in a language no one recognized. Sister Marianne's entries began hopeful, even joyful. She described feeling God's presence in nature, how the isolation cleared her mind. But by the 4th day, her tone changed. She mentioned the presence, never specifying what it was, only that it watched from the forest with stillness so perfect it became unbearable. By the 6th day, the entries became erratic. She wrote of dreams that bled into waking hours, of hearing hymns sung in reverse, of her own voice saying things she couldn't remember speaking aloud. But the most chilling part, the last entry, scribbled hastily, ink smeared by rain and trembling hands. It took Sister Agnes. The earth opened. We prayed. But he does not leave. He waits. He waits beneath us. There was no signature, no date, no mention of escape, just silence after that final plea. And when the journal ended, so too did the certainty that this had ever been a simple disappearance. Because now it was clear, something had been waiting, and it still might be. With renewed urgency, the investigators returned to the forest, but this time, not as skeptics. They were no longer searching for clues in a missing persons case. They were hunting something older, deeper. The dig site was expanded around the original triangle of stones, revealing what lay beneath, a pit. Perfectly circular, almost ritualistic. At its center, compacted layers of ash, bones, and soil, too orderly to be random. Something had burned there. Something had been buried there. But it was what they didn't find that disturbed them most. There were no personal belongings, no rosaries, no scraps of clothing, no trace of Sister Agnes, Sister Helena, or Sister Marianne, not even DNA. It was as if the women had been stripped of their physical existence entirely, reduced to nothing but memory and prayer. One forensic analyst muttered a single phrase under her breath as she stood over the ashes. This wasn't a campsite. It was a sacrifice. And just when they thought the trail had gone cold again, another discovery changed everything. Deep inside the forest, a ranger stumbled upon a narrow crevice hidden beneath a collapsed rock shelf. The entrance was narrow, but the air that escaped from within was dry and unnaturally cold. A team descended with ropes and lights. What they found sent shockwaves through the group, miles of carved stone passageways, spiraling downward into the mountain. No wildlife, no moss, just dead silence. And on the walls, scripture, etched backwards, in Latin. The deeper they ventured, the stranger the carvings became. At first, passages from Psalms and Isaiah, verses twisted in syntax, but still recognizable. Then came symbols, not Christian, not pagan, not traceable to any known civilization. Spiral formations, intersecting circles, symbols that evoked both the divine and the demonic. The walls felt alive, breathing, watching, as if the very stone held memory, and that memory was waking up. At the lowest point of the descent, they found it, a chamber, not large, not elaborate, just a room carved in the mountain, lit only by their flashlights. At the center stood a pedestal. Upon it, a second journal, smaller than the first, bound in black leather, covered in dust. Its cover bore no name, only a single, pressed symbol, 3 eyes arranged in a triangle. As one of the team members reached to open it, every light in the chamber flickered, and then failed. Darkness swallowed the chamber in a breath. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a pressure, a presence, as if the walls themselves were leaning in. No one spoke. No one dared move. The cold deepened, unnatural and biting, seeping into the bones. And in that suffocating quiet, a soft sound emerged. Not from the journal, not from any mouth, from within the stone. A hum, low, rhythmic, like chanting, but distant, muffled, as if coming from behind the walls themselves. The flashlights came back in bursts, flickering wildly as if struggling to stay tethered to reality. When the light finally stabilized, the pedestal was empty. The journal gone. Panic took over. The team scattered through the small chamber, searching the cracks, the floor, even one another. Nothing. No wind had blown. No one had touched it. It had simply vanished. And in its place, on the cold stone surface, 3 fresh fingerprints, seared into the rock like burns. They scrambled back to the surface, shaken, breathless, hollowed by something they couldn't name. But the damage had already been done. Every person who stepped into that chamber spoke of the same thing afterward: dreams. Or rather, nightmares. Each described an endless hallway carved in black stone. Whispers in Latin. A nun kneeling alone at the end, facing a wall. And always the same voice, deep and melodic, humming a broken hymn that echoed into eternity. One of the investigators quit the following morning, packed her belongings, disconnected her phone, and vanished without a word. Another was hospitalized after waking up screaming and attempting to claw something out of his skin, something he claimed was crawling through his veins, humming. The rest grew quiet, paranoid, unwilling to talk about what they'd seen, but unable to escape it. Whatever they'd awakened wasn't staying in the forest anymore. It had followed them home. And then came the footage. A park ranger reviewing old surveillance archives stumbled upon something buried in hours of untouched tape. A recording from a trail camera near the collapsed ridge where the first journal was found. The date on the footage? Exactly 35 years to the day after the nuns vanished. The image? A silhouette. A woman in a dark habit, standing motionless in the woods. Her face hidden in shadow. And in the background, barely audible, a single phrase repeated in a voice that sounded not quite human. "We are not finished." The footage went viral within hours, drawing the attention of media outlets, paranormal investigators, and religious scholars from around the world. Some claimed it was a hoax, a clever fabrication timed perfectly with the discovery of the journal. Others, however, weren't so quick to dismiss it. Linguists who analyzed the voice confirmed that it was layered, two tones speaking simultaneously, one slightly ahead of the other, like a delayed echo of itself. And the words, once cleaned of distortion, weren't just a warning. They were an invitation. The Vatican sent representatives within days. Quietly. No press conferences. No public statements. But locals reported seeing men in long coats and clerical collars entering the forest, armed not with maps or tools, but with relics. Old ones. Gold crosses bound in red thread. Books chained shut. Bottles of oil marked with sigils no priest had used in centuries. Whatever they believed was down there, it wasn't something they intended to study. It was something they meant to contain. Meanwhile, Margaret Langley, the niece of Sister Mary Ann, who had been only a child when the disappearance happened, came forward after 35 years of silence. Her eyes were tired, voice quiet, as she recounted a story no one had ever asked her to tell. She remembered receiving a letter from her aunt 3 days before the retreat. A short, cryptic note. One line burned itself into Margaret's memory. "If he sings to me, I will sing back. Tell them I chose it." This sentence changed everything. It wasn't just fear. It wasn't just possession. It was acceptance, willful submission. And perhaps that was the most terrifying part, that Sister Mary Ann and the others hadn't just been taken. They had answered call, participated in a rite no one outside their circle understood. Not a retreat, but a ritual. Not silence, but communion. And now, with 2 journals unearthed, bodies still missing, and an ancient structure hidden beneath a mountain, the question no one could shake was this: what had they really awakened? And more importantly, what happens when it decides to sing again? Margaret's appearance ignited new urgency around the investigation. For years, she had lived with the quiet ache of not knowing what happened to her aunt, haunted by fragments of family conversations abruptly cut short, glances exchanged in silence, and a convent that never once acknowledged her letters. But now, holding the journal in her hands, rereading the same line over and over, "If he sings to me, I will sing back," she began to question everything she had believed about her family's legacy. What if Sister Mary Ann hadn't been a victim, but a participant? Scholars who reviewed the journals noted a disturbing pattern. The entries followed a rhythm, a cadence that mirrored liturgical structure. It wasn't just a diary. It was a liturgy, a structured descent from prayer to fear to surrender. Every 3 pages, a prayer. Every 7, a confession. Every final line, an offering. The journals weren't cries for help. They were guides, written as though they were never meant to be found by rescuers, but by initiates. Further digging into the history of the convent uncovered unsettling details. The retreat wasn't official. It had never been logged. No priest had sanctioned it. No permission was recorded. And yet supplies had been ordered, transportation arranged, and time off scheduled for the 3 nuns. Almost as if someone, or something, had ensured they would go. Convent records showed Sister Mary Ann, Sister Agnes, and Sister Helena had become unusually reclusive in their final months. Late-night chapel visits, whisper conversations, and one incident, now long buried, in which Sister Agnes was found painting a black spiral beneath the altar. These discoveries prompted questions no one wanted to ask. Were these women manipulated, possessed, or had they willingly turned their faith towards something older than the church, something beneath it? A breakaway, rite disguised as devotion? And if so, who taught them? Where did they learn the songs that now echoed in dreams and forest winds? Whispers of a pre-Christian order, older than Rome, older than the cross, began surfacing in online forums and closed-door symposiums. A cult of sound, a theology of vibration. And all the while, reports began trickling in, not from Vermont, but from elsewhere. A farmer in rural Maine claimed he found symbols burned into the bark of his apple trees overnight. 3 interlocked eyes. A woman in Oregon recorded her sleep-talking, only to hear herself humming a song she swore she'd never heard before. A child in Belgium woke from a nightmare repeating the same phrase in Latin, Canabit terra, the earth shall sing. Whatever had been buried was no longer still. The song had begun to travel. Alarmed by the pattern, an independent research group began mapping these strange occurrences. Using satellite data, witness reports, and linguistic analysis of the journal entries, they found something shocking. The events formed a perfect arc, a spiral, stretching from Vermont and curling outward across the continent. Not randomly, geometrically, as if the forest had become the epicenter of a much larger design, as if the journal had acted not as a record, but as a key. At the center of that spiral stood Whispering Hollow, the last known location of the 3 nuns. A forest that had since regrown over the collapsed camp and the sealed chamber below. But locals had begun avoiding the area again. Strange lights, unseasonal fog, a low vibration at night, described by some as a singing wind, though no trees moved. Pets refused to enter. Birds flew around the perimeter. Whatever lay beneath had not died. It had gone quiet, and now it was learning how to reach. Margaret returned to the site, against every warning. Accompanied only by a sound technician and a former Vatican archivist, she stepped into the forest just before dawn. Her goal wasn't to dig or document or uncover. She wanted to listen. With high-frequency microphones and seismic sensors, they sat in complete silence for over 4 hours, the air still, the trees unmoving. And then it happened. A tone, barely audible to the human ear. Deep, sub-bass, lingering. The technician described it as a low-frequency hymn. Not music in the traditional sense, but something structured, repeating, mathematical. Below it, a second tone, then a third, then a voice, not a word, not a name, just breath, as if something massive had just awakened far beneath the surface. The forest, long feared for its silence, had finally begun to speak, not with words, but with resonance, with song. The Vatican archivist turned pale. Her voice cracked as she whispered the final phrase from a forbidden catechism she once translated but was told never to repeat aloud. He who sings beneath the ground does not sing alone. The phrase matched the journal, the symbols, the spiral, and in that moment, all 3 of them realized something horrifying. This wasn't the story of what happened to 3 nuns. This was the opening line of something much larger, and it had only just begun to be heard. Word of the recordings leaked online within days. The clips were short, distorted, low quality, but unmistakably unnatural. A frequency that made the chest tighten and the skin crawl. Audio engineers around the world tried to explain it, attributing the sounds to tectonic shifts, underground water movement, or feedback loops. But those who listened for too long began to change. Headaches, insomnia, vivid dreams of cloaked figures standing in vast, black cathedrals built from stone and bone. And always, in the background, the hum. One professor from a prestigious university published a paper describing the sound as a form of acoustic language, not meant to be heard with the ears, but interpreted by the body. Vibrations that bypass logic and embed themselves in the nervous system. A message not spoken in syllables, but felt in the spine. His paper was discredited within a week, and he resigned shortly after being found in his office, curled beneath his desk, whispering the same 4 words on repeat. It knows I heard. Meanwhile, the forest changed. Trees closest to the original site began to rot from within, their bark splitting open, revealing symbols beneath, not carved but grown. Fungi formed in circular patterns, spiraling outward in mathematical precision. Birds stopped nesting. Insects vanished. And the forest floor began to produce a thin, white mist every evening at twilight, regardless of temperature or season. Locals began calling it the breath. No one entered during those hours. No one dared. Margaret, torn between duty and fear, reviewed her aunt's journal again. This time, searching not for answers but for instructions. She noticed a pattern she hadn't seen before. Every seventh page contained a phrase written in a different ink, faint but deliberate. Pieced together, they formed a message. The voice below teaches the dead to sing, but it only needs one living conductor. The implication was devastating. One of them had let it out. All eyes turned to Sister Agnes, the most devout, the most silent, the one who stood at the forest's edge for hours, murmuring in an unknown tongue, the one whose body was never found. And in a final, fragmented entry now translated by a linguist, Sister Marianne wrote, "She walks without sound. The forest parts for her. We're no longer praying to God. We are listening to something that does not die." The realization dawned dark and slow. Sister Agnes never disappeared. She transformed. Following this revelation, a former seminarian turned researcher proposed a theory that sent chills through the academic community. What if the forest was never the source, only the amplifier? What if something deeper, something ancient and buried far below, had always been there, and those three nuns had simply become the first to hear it clearly? Not chosen but positioned. The right ears, the right silence, the right devotion. A perfect human tuning fork. This theory gained traction when an archaeologist uncovered documents linking Whispering Hollow to an indigenous legend long ignored by colonial historians. A tale of the sleeping mouth, a sacred place said to breathe when the stars aligned and the old sounds returned. The elders called it Katahar, which loosely translates to the earth's echo. In their stories, it was not a place of evil, but of balance, a prison that must never be sung to, a boundary that must never be named. But naming had already begun. Online forums lit up with users repeating the phrases from the journals. Music artists sampled the frequencies. TikTok creators filmed themselves at the forest's edge, daring the mist to reach them. Some joked. Some vanished. One account live-streamed from the forest interior for 17 minutes before the screen turned black. No scream. No crash. No signal loss. Just black. And a hum that continued for over 3 hours. Margaret, desperate to stop what she believed was now a spreading ritual, contacted the Vatican again. This time, she wasn't asking for help. She was warning them. She told them the forest was no longer local, that the song had migrated, that dreams were becoming shared, that people were beginning to hum without realizing it. Their response was brief. A single email. 3 words. We know. Prepare. But how does one prepare for a sound? How does one protect the soul from something that doesn't come through the ears, but through the bones, through memory? Margaret understood, then, that this wasn't about solving the mystery. It wasn't about closing a case. It was about containment. Not of the forest, not of the journals, but of human attention. Because if enough people listened, the song would no longer need the ground to rise. What began as isolated incidents soon became patterns. Choir directors from multiple states reported students instinctively harmonizing in unfamiliar tonal structures, progressions not found in any known musical scale. A hospice nurse in Pennsylvania claimed that 3 patients, all in different rooms, began humming the same melody moments before they passed. No one had taught it to them. No one had played it nearby. But when their bodies were examined, each was found clutching a torn piece of paper. Each one bore the same phrase, scrawled in trembling handwriting. "He sings from below." I answered. The phenomenon escalated. Dreams became communal. Individuals on opposite sides of the world began describing the same night visions. A chapel with no windows, a pulpit made of roots and stone, a figure in a black habit standing silently behind them. Some dismissed it as mass hysteria, a digital myth gone viral. But neurologists reviewing brain scans of those who reported these dreams found something else. A consistent pattern of neural activity, almost like echoes left by sound that wasn't physically present. Margaret watched this unfold like someone observing the slow spill of ink in water. At first, it seemed containable. Fringe cases, coincidences, anomalies. But now it was clear. The forest hadn't just opened a door. It had invited the world to step through. The journal hadn't been found by chance. It had waited for the right eyes, for the right voice. And now, she feared, it was no longer calling to the faithful. It was calling to the curious. In desperation, she turned back to her aunt's original journal, searching for anything, a ritual, a prayer, a reversal. She found a sequence of Latin stanzas written in reverse, tucked into the inside of the back cover. One phrase repeated 4 times, non canabit, sine nullus auscultat. It cannot sing if none listen. It wasn't an exorcism. It wasn't a weapon. It was a principle. The song required attention. It required audience. It needed ears. And in that chilling realization, Margaret understood the true danger. The sound wasn't just a curse. It was a contract, one sealed by awareness. Every person who heard it became a note in its melody, a chord in its body. And the more beautiful, the more haunting it sounded, the more complete it became. Humanity wasn't fighting back. Humanity was tuning itself to the thing buried below. The Vatican's final action came swiftly and without warning. Overnight, an exclusion zone was enforced around Whispering Hollow. Drones were deployed. Satellite surveillance blacked out. Every digital map scrubbed the coordinates. But by then, it was too late. Copies of the journals had already been uploaded. The sound samples replicated. The melody transformed into an artifact of curiosity, shared and remixed across platforms, turned into background music for shorts, animations, even lullabies. And slowly, the symptoms began appearing in new places. In cities, on trains, in waiting rooms, people pausing mid-task, heads tilting slightly, as if hearing something far away. Children drawing spirals without instruction. Choirs slipping into dissonant harmonies mid-hymn, only to stop and cry, unable to explain why their voices felt cold. The song had left the forest. The forest had done its part. Now the world itself was becoming the chamber. Margaret disappeared shortly after releasing her final warning video, a quiet, trembling monologue posted anonymously. She didn't beg for help. She didn't urge for action. She simply asked a question. What happens to a species that falls in love with the sound that ends it? Her eyes were hollow, her voice distant. And in the background of that final clip, if the volume is raised high enough, a faint humming can be heard. Investigators later recovered her belongings beside a rural chapel in upstate New York. On the pulpit lay a single piece of parchment. It was blank, except for 3 small, identical symbols drawn in ash. The triangle of eyes. No body was ever found. Just a patch of white grass growing in a perfect circle where the choir once stood. And the most terrifying part, the silence that followed. Not because it meant the song had ended, but because silence is what always comes before the next note. Authorities stopped issuing public statements. The official narrative was simple. Internet hysteria. Urban myth. No evidence. But those close to the investigations knew otherwise. Leaked documents hinted at entire departments being reassigned. Private contractors hired not for search operations, but for containment of auditory data. What began as a missing persons case had evolved into something far more abstract, a mimetic contagion, not a virus of the body, but of the mind. Meanwhile, in hospitals across the country, patients began reporting a strange new condition. Not pain, not illness, something else, a sensation, as if there was a frequency in the air they couldn't shut off. Like their thoughts were being scored, accompanied by music that no one else could hear. Some described it as beautiful, others as unbearable. In the worst cases, they begged doctors to cut the sound out of them, as if it were living inside their skulls. One neurologist compared brain scans and found something chilling, an exact pattern of neural spikes resembling the shape of a wave. A repeated structure, always in those who reported the song, and it didn't behave like a hallucination. It wasn't random. It was consistent. The song was embedding itself neurologically, becoming a reflex, a background hum in the human nervous system, a new layer of awareness. But it wasn't just individuals anymore. Entire groups began experiencing shared auditory events. Train passengers in Tokyo, subway riders in Chicago, a choir in Prague, all stopping mid-motion, mid-sentence, mid-note, and then humming, together. Harmonized, eyes blank, mouths moving as if guided by something invisible. The melody, once hidden beneath earth and ink, was now writing electromagnetic fields. Satellites, devices, thoughts. Margaret's voice returned in strange places, spliced into white noise, embedded in static between radio stations, woven into long-forgotten cassette tapes. And always the same phrase buried beneath her breath. Do not listen to finish it. Listen, and it begins. It became a mantra, a warning, a last breath of someone who had gone further than anyone before her, and paid the price. In the quiet town surrounding Whispering Hollow, life didn't return to normal. Nature itself had changed. Trees bloomed out of season. Soil turned unnaturally soft. Animals grew silent. Wind no longer blew. It vibrated. Residents reported their houses humming at night, glasses trembling on shelves, dogs howling at nothing. The forest, even when untouched, continued to pulse like a heart beneath the land. But most haunting were the new disappearances. Not all at once, never dramatic, but consistent. A teacher missing from her home in the middle of dinner, plates still warm. A hiker's boots left at the edge of a field, perfectly aligned. A family of 4 vanishing from their living room, television still glowing. In every case, one thing remained, a drawn spiral. Somewhere, in ash, in blood, in salt, and sometimes just burned into the ground. A theory began to emerge, one no one dared speak aloud, that perhaps the song had always been there, that the forest didn't create it, that the nuns didn't discover it, that they had simply heard it first, that human history was a veil stretched tightly over something older, humming softly, waiting for the world to get quiet enough to hear it. And now, in a world overrun with signals, frequencies, microphones, receivers, and endless screens, perhaps we become too good at listening. We had built a planet wired for reception, and the song had simply used it, because in the end, it didn't need believers. It didn't need prayers. It only needed curiosity, and someone willing to turn the volume up. So the question no longer was, what happened to the 3 nuns? That answer had long been consumed. The real question, the one too large, too terrifying for most to accept, was this: how many of us have already heard the first note and just haven't realized we've started singing back? In a secure facility hidden beneath the Alps, a group of interdisciplinary scholars, theologians, and linguists gathered for what was internally called the Echo Conference. None of them were strangers to ancient texts, anomalous events, or unexplained sound phenomena. But what brought them together wasn't curiosity, it was urgency. Because for the first time, centuries of scattered myths and fragmented rituals were beginning to align into something cohesive. A structure, a system, a score. They studied the journal entries, the digital spectrograms of the hum, and the behavioral changes in those exposed. The results were chilling. The song, if it could still be called that, wasn't random. It followed a pattern not unlike a symphony, with repeating themes, ascending keys, and a closing motif that, once completed, seemed to alter the listener permanently. One researcher theorized that the song was a form of biological programming, a mechanism encoded in sound waves to rewrite the body's perception of reality. Meanwhile, more reports emerged from completely unconnected regions. People building identical stone formations in forests they had never visited. Children drawing cathedrals shaped like roots. Nightmares of being buried alive beneath music. These weren't isolated cases. They were echoes, as if the melody had begun to harmonize across the globe. And the worst part, no one knew what happened to those who hummed the final note. No one who did ever spoke again. Margaret's voice, long gone from the public eye, reappeared in a private file sent to a member of the Vatican's archive. The video was short. She looked gaunt, translucent almost, seated beside what looked like a stone altar in the middle of a blackened grove. She said only this: "You were right. It was never about belief. It was about timing. And now, the choir is everywhere. We've just forgotten we're the ones singing." Her words confirmed their fears. This wasn't a singular event. It was a cycle, one that humanity had perhaps undergone before and lost memory of. A song that waits until language is ripe, until sound travels fast enough, until enough people are listening with open minds and unguarded hearts. And now, In the age of algorithms and infinite access, the stage was finally set. That night, across 4 continents, something strange occurred. Unrelated broadcast networks experienced a simultaneous disruption. Not static, not silence, but a tone, a pure note, sustained for exactly 33 seconds. Most dismissed it as a glitch. Others recorded it, analyzed it, slowed it down. Beneath the surface, embedded in the waveform, a voice. Faint, dissonant, repeating one line. We are not finished. We were only beginning. Religious leaders from multiple faiths gathered for an emergency council, but found no scripture prepared for this. No prophecy, no instruction, because what was unfolding wasn't divine. It was older, beneath divinity, beneath myth. It was foundational, prelinguistic, not a message from the heavens, but a frequency from the earth's bones, a vibration that reached the soul not through faith, but through frequency. And among the chaos, whispers spread about Sister Agnes, not as a victim, not even as a cautionary tale, but as a prototype, the first to truly hear, the first to submit. And it became clear that somewhere, somehow, she was still active, still moving, still singing. Sightings poured in from all corners. An elderly nun with hollow eyes, standing beneath streetlights, watching, always watching. And behind her, silence so deep it rang in the ears. Some believe she is now the conductor, that the entity no longer needs to emerge because she moves on its behalf. A vessel tuned so perfectly to its resonance that her very presence changes the pitch of the world around her. Wherever she goes, devices fail, animals freeze, children cry, and the sky feels closer. And so, the world continued, not ending, but tuning, gradually adjusting, one note at a time, until soon, perhaps very soon, the final chorus will arrive. And by then, those listening won't hear it as horror. They'll hear it as something familiar, something comforting, a melody they've known all along, only forgotten. Until now, in small towns where radio towers once buzzed with talk shows and local news, new signals began to bleed through. Not from stations, but from beneath the static itself. Listeners would pause mid-dial, caught by a sound that wasn't quite a voice, wasn't quite a song. It made the breath catch, the skin prickle, and some people never changed the station again. They just sat, listening, for hours, for days. The term harmonic infection began circulating among scientists and psychologists. It referred to individuals who exhibited increased sensitivity to rhythm and tone, as well as strange behavioral shifts. These people became disoriented in silence. They sought out white noise. They hummed unconsciously. But most alarming of all, they smiled while asleep. Always the same curved smile, as if responding to music no one else could hear. Schools began noticing patterns in student behavior. Synchronized tapping during exams, humming during reading time, children waking from naps with bleeding noses and drawings of tunnels lined with faces. One teacher caught an entire classroom whispering in unison, "He is beneath us, and he listens when we are still." Parents pulled their children from those schools. Some moved away entirely, but it didn't help. The song traveled farther than they ever could. In an abandoned church in Ireland, a team of acoustics researchers placed subsonic microphones in the altar stone as part of a historical preservation effort. They expected to hear echoes, perhaps animal movement. What they recorded instead was a loop, a single tone with layered harmonics that traced the same interval found in the forest recordings from Vermont. 1 octave lower, slower, but unmistakable. It had made its way across the ocean, and it was deepening. And beneath all of this, like a low string in an orchestra, ran the memory of the 3 nuns. Their names now spoken not in grief, but in awe, as if they had crossed a threshold no one else dared touch. No bodies were ever found, no evidence of struggle, only their words, scattered in ink and sound. To sing with him is not to die. It is to become the song. And now, the world was listening. It was in Sao Paulo where the first full convergence was recorded. A surveillance system monitoring subway vibrations picked up a frequency that synchronized perfectly with the heart rates of commuters. It lasted 21 seconds. No one heard it consciously, but 23 passengers left the train in tears, unable to explain what they'd felt. One wrote in a notebook, I remembered something I've never lived. Around the world, sleep clinics filled with patients reporting identical dreams. A stone chapel with no windows, underground. A hum that started in their teeth and ended in their bones. A voice, not speaking, but resonating inside them, rewriting their thoughts in chords. Psychologists were baffled. The symbols from Sister Mary Ann's journal began appearing in those dreams, even in patients who had no exposure to the story. It was as if the melody now carried meaning, capable of spreading without words. Margaret's name was no longer found in news reports, but it began appearing in strange places, deep in the metadata of audio files, embedded in QR codes on forgotten web pages. And when one researcher decrypted a corrupted file titled hollow_final.wave, all it contained was her voice, slowed and reversed. One phrase, repeated, "You didn't find the song found you." By this point, governments had quietly begun to panic. Military bases reported instruments picking up deep-frequency pulses every 13 days, rhythmic, escalating, as if counting down, not to an event, but to a completion. Seismologists confirmed the sounds weren't tectonic. They came from much deeper, below magma, below measurable space, a resonance that seemed to respond to the vibrations of human cities, like something aligning beneath the surface, preparing to rise. And still, no one could say what the song truly was. Not a weapon, not a spirit, not a god, just a presence, a force, something old, something patient, something that once sang to 3 women in a quiet forest retreat, and now waited for the rest of the world to sing back. Then, without warning, the song stopped. All around the world, in the forests, the dreams, the frequencies buried beneath cities, the hum went silent. No more signals. No more dreams. The drawings ceased. Radios returned to static. The spirals vanished from chalk and glass and skin. It was as if a switch had been flipped. Some called it deliverance. Others knew better. Because silence, in this story, was never an absence. It was anticipation. In the stillness that followed, the world felt paused. Birds flew lower. The air held tighter to heat. People forgot words mid-sentence, as if something in their brain was waiting for a cue. But none came. Until the night, the stars changed. It began in a remote observatory in Finland. Astronomers tracking a distant cluster noticed a peculiar shift in one patch of sky, as though the stars there were dimming in unison, then pulsing faintly, not in light, but in rhythm. The pulse matched the exact structure of the original forest frequency. They watched in horror as that rhythm spread star to star, constellations becoming chords, galaxies forming intervals. The universe wasn't watching us. It was answering. Within 48 hours, similar phenomena were reported from Chile, Tibet, Namibia. The same pulsing, the same rhythm. It was no longer just the earth resonating. The stars were joining. The melody had become cosmic. And then the song returned, not in sound, but in thought. A pressure behind the eyes, a weight in the chest. The feeling of standing at the top of a staircase in the dark, knowing something waits at the bottom, and it's climbing toward you, slowly. People began to gather in silence. In fields, in churches, in empty stadiums. No one spoke. No signs. No instructions. But across the world, people who had never met stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting. Some wept. Others simply smiled, as if recognizing something they had long forgotten. And in those crowds, if you listened carefully, you would hear them humming, not in fear, in acceptance. The melody now existed beyond devices. It pulsed in the pressure between thunder and lightning, in the pause between heartbeats, in the spaces where children stopped speaking mid-sentence to stare at nothing, eyes glazed, listening. It was in the dirt, in the marrow, in the stillness before sleep. And most terrifying of all, it no longer sounded alien. It sounded familiar. One last fragment of Margaret's writing surfaced, found in the jacket of a rescue worker who had entered Whispering Hollow alone and never spoken again. The note read, "When we feared it, it waited. When we followed it, it watched. But when we loved it, it sang back." Her words weren't of horror. They were of completion. She had heard the final verse, and she had understood. Sister Agnes was seen one final time, or so they say. A train passenger claimed she stood on a platform in silence, her black habit motionless against the wind. As the train passed, every light inside flickered. Every passenger felt pressure in their lungs. And one child turned to his mother, placed a hand over his heart, and whispered, "She's almost finished." Because this was never about a retreat, never about a journal, never about 3 missing nuns. It was about us, a world too loud to hear what had always been humming beneath it, until the moment we finally fell quiet and listened. And then the earth sang. It began with a tremor so subtle it didn't register on seismographs, not as movement, but as vibration. Buildings didn't shake, trees didn't fall, but people felt it, in their spines, in their teeth, in their dreams. Beneath cities and oceans and deserts, something massive shifted, not upward, not outward, but inward, as if the world itself had begun tuning its core to something far beyond human comprehension. In a chapel buried under centuries of dust in northern Ethiopia, monks awoke to a sound they call the breath of creation. The great bell, untouched for over 500 years, rang on its own, and as it did, the walls of the chapel cracked to reveal carvings older than the structure itself, spirals, eyes, and 3 figures kneeling beneath a triangle of stars. Their faces worn down, but the posture was unmistakable, reverence. At the same time, a research vessel in the Arctic Circle recorded a frequency rising from beneath a rapidly melting ice shelf. Scientists believed it to be an undersea quake, until the waveform showed rhythm, consistency, meter. When translated through software, it formed a pattern identical to that found in Sister Marianne's journal, but longer, as if the journal had only ever been the overture. People stopped resisting, not out of submission, but out of recognition. The world wasn't ending. It was completing. It was finishing a song we had only ever known in fragments. Lullabies, chants, grief, hymns, breath. The melody was older than memory, embedded in the silence between every heartbeat across every generation. And now, all of it was returning. Margaret's voice returned one final time, not on video, but through a live signal hijack during a global broadcast. It lasted 13 seconds. "It doesn't matter who began the song," she said. "It matters only who finishes it. And we are the final verse." No one remembers the exact moment it happened. There was no explosion, no blinding light, no screams, just a stillness, a pause in all things, as if time took one long breath. And in that breath, the sound came, not loud, not deafening, complete. A chorus not of voices, but of everything. Wind through hollow trees, whales beneath the ice, tectonic plates humming at the base of the world, the murmurs of unborn children, the crackle of stars long dead. All of it in harmony. The sky shimmered, not in color, but in feeling. People described it like emotion made visible. Grief, joy, wonder, surrender. For one impossible instant, every living soul felt known. Not seen, not judged, heard. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. Silence returned, not as absence, but as answer. And when people woke, if they had ever truly been asleep, they found nothing changed. No apocalypse, no fire, just the quiet knowledge that something ancient and buried and patient had finally sung itself whole. And now it rested. But every so often, in the wind between buildings, or in the static between stations, or in the pause before a child speaks their first word, there is a hum, a single note, a reminder, not of fear, not of doom, but of completion, because some songs are not written to be performed. Some are written to become the world. And it all began with 3 nuns, a forest, and a journal written not for the past, but for the moment the earth was finally ready to listen. In the months that followed, something subtle but undeniable began to change in the world. Not in the weather, not in politics, not even in religion, but in attention. People began to speak more slowly, to pause before answering. Crowds became less chaotic, and silences in conversation, no maze, carried tension. They carried presence. It was as if humanity, after hearing the full song, could no longer bear the noise it once considered normal. Music changed. Composers abandoned traditional scales, favoring tones that lingered unresolved, inviting listeners to dwell in uncertainty. Some claimed these new compositions stirred memories they could not place, dreams they never lived. Painters across different continents began illustrating identical images. A spiraled chapel, a tree with faces in its bark, and always, always, 3 figures in black, standing at the edge of a clearing listening. Children born after the event came into the world different, calmer, with eyes that locked into yours a moment too long. They often hummed in their sleep, and some drew symbols before learning to write letters. Many would wake saying things like, "I almost remembered it," or "She's not done yet." Doctors were baffled, but parents, those who had heard the song, understood without needing words. The children weren't broken. They were in tune. And yet, the world didn't descend into mysticism or chaos. There were no cults, no revolutions, just stillness, a collective recognition that life had always been surrounded by a deeper sound, one only now heard, one only now remembered. Humanity didn't evolve. It realigned, not toward God, not toward salvation, but toward a tone that had always been humming beneath the static of existence. The name Agnes faded from headlines. Her image became folklore. But in certain corners, hospitals, mountain temples, underground railways, her presence was still felt, not as a warning, not as a myth, but as a note, a frequency that lives in the gap between fear and awe. She had become what the forest once hid, not a messenger, but a mirror. And so, life continued, as it always had, with sorrow, with love, with mystery. But now, beneath each of those, a subtle awareness remained, that the world was not just seen or touched or spoken. It was sung, that our actions, our silences, our griefs and joys were all part of a larger composition, not one of order, but of resonance. We were never expected to understand it, only be tuned to it. There were those who tried to return to how things were before, who filled their homes with noise, avoided silence at all costs, buried themselves in distraction. But even they, in quiet moments, found themselves humming, not out of fear, but because something within them remembered. And in that remembering, something deep inside softened. Margaret's final writings, released posthumously, were not warnings or revelations. They were questions, gentle, open-ended, written in ink that faded at the edges. What if the world was never silent? What if it was only waiting for us to be quiet enough to hear it? Her final page was blank, a space left intentionally unfinished, like a rest in a musical measure, waiting. And so, the forest grew back. The chapel crumbled. The stars resumed their indifferent glow. But now, in the deepest parts of night, those still enough to listen swear they can hear it. Not the song itself, but the space it left behind. A space shaped exactly like wonder. Exactly like memory, because the song was never meant to be an answer. It was always a question, and the question was always us. Years passed, and while headlines returned to their usual rhythm of crisis and spectacle, a quiet undercurrent flowed beneath everything. In the corners of classrooms, in hospice rooms, in quiet cafes at closing time, people began to share the same kinds of stories, not of miracles or visions, but of moments when time seemed to hold its breath, when a stranger hummed the same unknown melody, when a child, no older than 5, placed their hand on your chest and said, "You're almost in tune." A global study on sleep patterns revealed something astonishing. More than 60% of participants reported recurring dreams that ended the same way, walking alone through a quiet forest, hearing a single note carried by wind, and feeling no fear, only recognition. Scientists dismissed it as mass suggestion. But deep down, those who dreamed knew they hadn't invented the place. They had returned to it. In a village in Nepal, a group of monks began building a structure based on what they called sonic memory. No blueprints, no measurements, only vibration. They claimed they were not building a temple. They were tuning the land. And when asked where they learned the design, the eldest monk simply said, "We remembered." The shape of the building matched the layout of the original retreat chapel, down to the position of each stone. Some feared this new world, not because it was dangerous, but because it demanded stillness, a quality humanity had nearly lost. But others embraced it. People gathered not in protest, but in resonance. Silent concerts, shared breaths, walks without words, as if the entire species was learning how to be again, not for purpose, but for presence. And all of this, all of it, began with a journal, with 3 women who chose silence over spectacle, who vanished not in terror, but in surrender. They had heard something beyond sound, and in choosing to follow it, they became the note that would one day bring the world back into harmony with itself. Old audio tapes once discarded in dusty archives were revisited. What seemed like static or corrupted reels were, in fact, layered frequencies, imperceptible to the ear but deeply felt by the nervous system. When played back through water, the ripples formed spirals. When fed through voice synthesis, one phrase emerged again and again in countless languages. You have always been singing. In the ruins of Whispering Hollow, moss had overtaken stone, trees had swallowed paths, and the lake had grown still. But a lone birch tree bore markings no one could explain, not carvings, but natural growth patterns in perfect spirals, as if the tree had listened. Scientists called it pareidolia, but those who had heard the song knew better. The forest hadn't forgotten. It had simply waited for silence to grow again. A final artifact surfaced, an old wooden cross, found half buried behind the chapel's remains. Burned into the back, barely visible, was a single sentence. Let those who remember teach others to listen. It was signed not with a name, but a symbol, 3 interlocking circles, like ripples in still water. The same symbol Sister Marianne had once drawn in the journal, over and over, until the ink bled through the page. And so, the world continued not with a crescendo, but with a hum, a low, eternal tone that now lived in every whisper, every silence, every shared gaze. We didn't need to explain it. We didn't need to prove it. We only needed to protect the space it created, the sacred stillness where the unknown could breathe and the forgotten could return. Because the greatest songs are not the ones we remember, but the ones that remember us. Children born decades after the event still carry the echo, not in speech, not in belief, but in presence. They didn't crave attention like those before them. Instead, they sought depth, long silences, music with no lyrics, eyes that met without fear. Teachers found them strange. Parents sometimes worried. But the children were not lost. They were listening. And every so often, they would hum in unison with no prompt, no melody, just instinct, as if something beneath their skin was tuning itself to something ancient, something sacred. In Brazil, a healer claimed she could hear people's dissonance. She described it not as illness or sin, but as notes played out of key. Her treatments didn't involve words, only vibrations. She placed tuning forks near the heart, water bowls near the feet, and sat in silence as the body remembered what the mind had forgotten. Many wept, not from pain, but from alignment. Meanwhile, the Vatican quietly released a document never meant for public eyes, a collection of testimonies from priests who had visited Whispering Hollow after the incident. They spoke not of fear or exorcism, but of awe. One wrote, "I heard the voice of God, not as a man, but as a chord so complete I vanished into it." Another wrote, "I was no longer praying. I was being prayed." And the last entry ended simply. They were not taken. They became the breath. Cultural traditions long suppressed began to reemerge. Indigenous songs from tribes thought extinct were suddenly remembered by youth who had never been taught them. Ancient rhythms echoed in street performances, in lullabies, in the spaces between subway stations. It was as if the memory of the earth itself was rising through the people, not to be celebrated, but to be sung again. And so the melody endured, not as something you could play, but something you could feel, something that lived in the moments we slowed down, the times we allowed ourselves to sit with sorrow or wonder or the silence of the stars. It was never about solving the mystery. It was about learning to live with it, like a note that never ends. In a small village in Japan, a school was built with no bells, no clocks, and no walls. Time there flowed differently. Children were taught to move not by schedule, but by rhythm, to feel when it was time to gather, when it was time to speak, when it was time to be still. And somehow it worked. No chaos, no noise, just an invisible agreement, shared like a song they were all born knowing. Elders began to speak again. Many who had gone silent in nursing homes for years suddenly asked to be taken outside at dusk. They would sit in gardens, close their eyes, and smile. When asked what they heard, they all said the same thing, the part one had forgotten. Some passed quietly minutes later, not in fear, but in perfect rest, as if the final note of their lives had been played in key. One remote village in the Andes built wind chimes from bones of animals long past, not as art, but as translation. When the wind passed through them, they claimed it was not random sound, but reply. And when asked what the wind was saying, they simply said, "She is still listening." Meanwhile, somewhere in Alaska, a man hiked alone into a dense, untouched forest. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He left no map, only a note on his door, to follow what they followed. He was never seen again. But weeks later, hikers reported finding a single pair of footprints near a frozen creek, and hearing, from deep within the woods, a low, pure tone, sustained, unwavering. Because the story was never meant to conclude. It was never a riddle to solve, or a tragedy to mourn. It was a song, a sacred, unspeakable melody that needed the silence of a world to be heard again. Somewhere in Morocco, a blind woman began to draw. No one had ever taught her. She claimed the images weren't hers, that she was only remembering with her hands. What emerged on her canvas were not faces or landscapes, but frequencies, visual patterns resembling sound waves frozen in time. When musicians began converting those shapes back into sound, they heard something that chilled them. The same five-note motif found in Sister Marianne's journal, expanded, elongated, reinterpreted across centuries and cultures. In Prague, a library digitizing forgotten manuscripts uncovered a curious trend. Dozens of unrelated authors, from different eras and regions, had doodled the same symbol in the margins, 3 concentric spirals, some with eyes in the center, some with tiny figures kneeling beneath them. None of these authors had ever met. None had written about music. And yet, every one of them had echoed the mark that began in a nun's quiet scribble, now inscribed across forgotten time. People who once feared silence now sought it. Busy cities saw a rise in quiet zones, parks, cafes, even trains designed for stillness. And within these spaces, strangers met not to talk, but to listen. To the world. To each other. To the melody buried beneath everything. What once was noise became reverence. Not because anyone demanded it, but because the memory of the song had made noise feel unkind. In churches, mosques, and temples, leaders began to preach less and pause more. Some spoke of God as frequency, not form. Others taught that creation was less about speaking things into being and more about listening them into form. Even those without faith found themselves returning to these sacred places, not to believe, but to remember how to be still enough to feel. And in the heart of the Amazon, a tribal elder who had never left the jungle spoke a sentence in a dialect nearly lost. "The trees are singing again." When asked what he meant, he tapped his chest and whispered, "They were never singing to themselves. They were waiting for us to sing back." In an abandoned monastery in France, a child stumbled upon a sealed stone door. It had no keyhole, no markings, only a groove across its surface that vibrated faintly when touched. The monks, long gone, had left no records of what it held. But when a recording device was placed against it, a sound emerged, impossibly low, impossibly old. Not words, not music, but something in between, like memory, wrapped in vibration. No one opened the door. They didn't need to, because whatever lived behind it wasn't meant to be seen. It was meant to be felt. And for the first time in history, people no longer felt the urge to uncover everything. Curiosity gave way to reverence, to restraint, as if humanity had finally learned. Not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some are meant to hold us together. There were no monuments built for the 3 nuns. No global ceremonies. Only scattered candles in unexpected places, subway corners, forest paths, balconies at dawn. Their names became less important than their silence. Their silence became more important than their story. Because what they gave to the world was not explanation, but space. A space large enough to hold the sacred unknown. Old languages began to resurface, not through scholars, but through dreams. Children muttered phrases in tongues no one could trace. and when translated phonetically, many of these utterances formed the same sentence. We were always meant to remember through silence. It became the mantra of a movement that had no leader, no book, no name, just a shared recognition that listening was an act of love. And maybe that was the point all along. That beneath theology, beneath science, beneath story and symbol, the truest connection to the divine was stillness. Not empty, not cold, but full. A stillness that sings without sound. A stillness that waits until we are quiet enough to remember that we, too, were once part of the original chord. In a remote observatory on the edge of the Arctic Circle, a group of scientists studying auroral frequencies stumbled upon something inexplicable. On certain nights, when the northern lights danced closest to the Earth, their equipment picked up not electromagnetic waves, but what one technician called a low, endless harmony. It wasn't measurable. It didn't fit any known spectrum. But when played through analog speakers, people in the lab wept. Not from sadness, but from remembrance. A linguist listening to the recording swore she heard words layered beneath the sound. She spent weeks isolating frequencies, analyzing syllables. Finally, with trembling hands, she transcribed one phrase. They did not disappear. They returned to the chord. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "It's not a sound. It's home." In the forest where it all began, nature reclaimed everything. No signs, no markers, just moss, wind, and silence. Yet hikers who passed through reported strange experiences, time feeling slower, memories returning more vivid, and in some cases, hearing humming that matched no bird, no stream, no wind. Some brought instruments to try and capture it. None could, because what they heard wasn't meant to be repeated, only received. Elsewhere in the world, elderly nuns began to pass peacefully in their sleep, each with the same faint smile. When asked about their final wishes, many responded the same way. "Just let the wind carry me back to her." None explained who her was, but their last breath always seemed to exhale harmony. And so, the melody that was never written, never performed, never shared publicly, became the most important song the world had ever not heard. A sacred silence, a pause between chords, a question without a question mark. And in that space, we remembered something ancient. Not about God, not about death, but about belonging. One day, in a quiet corner of a library, a young girl opened a forgotten drawer and found an old tape labeled only with 3 interlocking spirals. She played it. No sound came out. She tried again. Still silence. She was about to give up when her grandmother entered the room, froze, and whispered, "You hear it too?" The girl paused. "I don't hear anything." The old woman smiled, touched her heart, and said, "That's exactly it. Because perhaps, in the end, the greatest truths are not spoken aloud. Perhaps the final note was never meant for our ears, but for the part of us that remembers before remembering, the soul before the name, the silence before the breath, the space where the nuns vanished and the world began to hum again. No monuments were needed. No ending was written. Only a hush, stretching across generations, holding us all in one long, sustained note. The kind that lingers not in the air, but in the marrow. The kind that says, "You were always part of this. You just forgot how to listen." And so life continued. Babies cried. Lovers kissed. Storms broke windows. But beneath it all, in every gasp, every pause, every closing of eyes, the melody remained. Waiting. Gentle. Undemanding. Eternal. Because the forest never needed to speak. It only needed us to become quiet enough to hear it again. Some stories don't end. They dissolve into silence. What began as a mystery, the sudden disappearance of 3 nuns, became something far greater than a case to solve. It became a mirror, a reflection not of what was lost, but of what we had forgotten to hear within ourselves. In their silence, we rediscovered the sacredness of stillness. In their absence, we remembered what it means to be present. Their story was never about where they went, but about where we have not been, within. We spend so much of life chasing answers, fearing silence, and filling every gap with noise. But perhaps the most powerful revelations are not shouted, nor even spoken. They are felt. understood without words, and carried not in memory, but in the rhythm of our breath, the pause between our thoughts, the way we sit with the unspeakable and still feel held. The journal they left behind was not a clue, it was an invitation. And maybe that's the lesson. Not everything sacred has a name. Not every miracle leaves a mark. Sometimes, the most profound truths come wrapped in quiet, waiting for the moment when we're finally ready to listen without needing to understand. The forest didn't demand worship. The melody never sought fame. But both waited, for us to return to a place we never really left. Only silenced. As you let this story settle into your soul, ask yourself, when was the last time you truly listened? Not with your ears, but with your whole being? What songs have been waiting for your stillness? What whispers have followed you through years of noise? The nuns did not vanish in fear. They stepped into harmony. And maybe now, it's your turn to remember how to hear. If this story moves something inside you, even in the quietest part, share it. Let others feel it. And if you'd like to walk with us through more journeys like this, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment about what you heard in the silence. Because sometimes the conversation that matters most is the one that begins after the final word is spoken.